Hello. This is the fourth installment in my reviews for the human geography exam coming up here on Thursday. This is going to be the fourth, which is basic culture. And so these are going to be the big ideas that often play a role in all the cultural units. So you got to kind of know them. And welcome to stately Bleakley Manor behind me. All right, big ideas that you need to focus on this one is the idea of folk and pop culture and how you can identify folk and pop culture. So, again, think about folk being associated with traditional societies. This is usually the basis of our holidays. It's passed through families. It was represented by work songs, which are our traditional folk songs. This is usually where we get our customs. And so think about that as folk. And then pop is more media driven. It is usually something you buy. So if you're thinking about like music or art or something like that, it's probably something you don't make yourself. Um, and it is usually something that we don't do ourselves. So think about building your own house versus buying a house, and think of the materials that would make up that house. If I'm building it myself, it's probably going to be stuff that I have access to around me, stone or bamboo or wood or whatever. Whereas if it's a pop house, like a typical suburban house now, those parts come from all over the place and probably somebody else builds them. So, one of the things that you need to be thinking about in housing is what's the material made out of, who makes it. That probably tells you whether it's a folk house or a pop house. Um, is a lot of the architecture going to be on the exam? Probably not, but you are going to want to know about the basic ideas behind suburban housing, the Levittown history as to where the whole idea of making suburbs comes from. And could you spot the differences between a pop house, like a suburban house, and more traditional housing that you might see? Now, one of the things that may come up is in American folk housing. Think about like the New England style when we talked about that, and the Tidelands and that sort of thing. Think about what they were made out of and what materials were available. That is something that may come up, just so you know. Know the difference between habits and customs. Customs are what we all do, habits are what we do on an individual basis. And we usually learn our customs and sometimes our habits from our family. Know your norms and mores, the rules of society, what is acceptable behavior, what is not acceptable behavior. That's again usually comes from our folk culture and passed down through our families. We learn them even if we don't think we're really learning them, like the proper way to dress, for instance, the what is a proper thing to eat and not eat. What do you do in public? How do you use your voice in public? All that sort of stuff that we learn as small children. And these become the sort of unspoken rules of society. Now, some of them do become so important that they actually get turned into laws. But that's what we're talking about there. Remember your cultural hearts. This is where civilizations get their start. There's not very many of them. Mesopotamia, Egypt, Indus River Valley, the Yangtze River Valley in China, the Mayan Empire is based in Central America. These areas are special as far as culture goes because that is where we get our ideas of religious concepts. What does government look like? Where do we get our laws? They shape a lot of our cultural institutions, these cultural hearts. So even though we weren't born in these places, the ideas have diffused into other areas, and that's where we get our basic ideas about civilization and culture. So make sure that you remember where those are. They are often tied to writing systems. So if you're looking at ideograms versus letters, how do we express ourselves in language through written form? That kind of comes back to this sort of thing where we get these original ideas of how to write things down. Taboos and terrors. Taboos are the things that are forbidden in society. So, generally speaking, things that are considered so awful in society that we don't really even talk about them very much. Um, Taboos could include things like incest. It could talk about forbidden foods, usually because of religion, that you're not supposed to eat that or drink that or whatever. Um, but there are things that we're just not supposed to do in society, and because they're considered so offensive that we won't do them. That's the idea behind taboos. Terroirs are your preferences. And so originally it comes out of wine culture because terroir was referring to where you could grow the right kinds of grapes to make wine. And so there were preferences in areas to grow grapes to make wine. But that idea kind of expanded beyond that and became the things that we prefer in our society. So in some societies, eating pork and beef and chicken is okay. But in other societies, maybe eating the beef or the pork is not okay. That becomes taboo. You don't eat those. In American culture, horse is usually not on the menu, so that's considered not part of our food terroirs. It actually, for many people, it's a taboo. Don't eat Bessie. Um, so know what they are, what they look like, examples of them, because they may come up. Know how traditional societies impact gender. Yes, it's another gender topic. So think about in traditional societies, what is the traditional roles of man and woman? And men are supposed to go out and make the money and support the family. Women are supposed to stay home, maintain the house, and provide the children and raise the children. That's traditional. And think about societies and culture that are still very traditional and that those rules are still expected versus other societies where those roles may have changed over time, where we're looking at less inequality between the sexes. And think about how that might impact people, especially if there's some sort of cultural change going on. If you have a very traditional society that is beginning to industrialize, for instance, that means people are moving into the cities, they're coming in contact with other kinds of people. It may well be that they start seeing that maybe women have other roles other than just childbearing. And if you don't want that to change, that might impact how you view the world. And you might become more and more fundamentalist over time, where you want those traditional values, usually religious values, to be important in your society. And you don't want things to change. And so there may be conflicts in societies between this idea of traditional society, especially in gender roles, as opposed to a modern society where there's considered more equality between sexes, where women have other options in that society. And again, people get very upset about changing traditional values and traditional societies, the elements of their societies. They don't like things to change, and that can lead to conflicts. Uh, we need to look at assimilation and acculturation. Assimilation is when somebody takes on another culture and they abandon their old culture. You see this a lot with migrants, especially if they're going from one very different society to another, that it may well be that they decide they're going to shed their own old culture and become this new culture. So they give up all the elements of what they used to be. In acculturation, you take elements of it. And again, you see this a lot in migrant societies where they will take on the language and the dress and maybe some of the food habits. Maybe they'll live in different conditions, but they're not giving up generally things like their religion, for instance. They'll probably hang on to that. They may still speak their home language at home rather than the marketplace. So you're not doing it all the way in the case of acculturation, the way that you are in assimilation. Assimilation can be voluntary, like I said, somebody deciding to become somebody else's culture. In many cases, it is forced. It is involuntary assimilation, and that is forcing somebody to give up their culture and become some other culture. And we saw this with the treatment of indigenous populations around the world, in the United States and Australia and other places. We see it in places like Russia. especially the old Russian Empire, the Soviet Union, where they feared the idea of having different ethnic groups in the country. And so they would do forced assimilation to make everybody Russian, because that was the dominant ethnic group. And so you may see maybe questions about forced assimilation or acculturation, things like that, just to be on the safe side. Remember the elements of culture, which are artifacts. These are the physical manifestations of culture. And they're not necessarily old things. The things you have around you could well be artifacts. A fork, for instance, you eat with. Well, not everybody eats with a fork. And so that fork actually says something about the culture that you come from. Now, it could be old stuff. That is often how we refer to these old things, like the figurines that I showed you from prehistory and stuff. That we can learn something about the culture by looking at how they sculpted things. But anything that is manufactured by a human being, made by a human being, can be considered an artifact if it's telling us something about the culture that made it. You also have the sociofacts. These are the things in our society that are not quite as tangible as artifacts, but it's things like government ideas. What do we think government should look like? Economic systems often fall into this category, that we have ideas about economics and how they should be done. Now, these things, although they're very big, broad concepts, could change over time through revolution or through deciding we're going to do something different now. But those are the sociofacts, the big ideas in society. And then in the very background, you have the metafacts. The metafacts are the things that are like religious concepts that do not change very little, if at all, over time. And so, if you come from certain societies, then your ideas about religion probably follow some pretty basic paths. That there is life after death, for instance. That's a very big concept. And people who follow religions that believe in life after death, they're not likely to give up that idea. So, this is something that tells us something about that society and is largely unchangeable. It's not going to make a whole lot of differences over time. So keep all that in mind. Think about other hearths that might be out there, not necessarily just cultural hearths. Remember, we talked about music. And sometimes music comes up. So think about your musical hearths. If you're looking at jazz, it could be New Orleans. If you're looking at hip hop or rap, it's probably either LA or New York. It could well be that you're looking at the blues. That's usually associated with the South or maybe St. Louis. Country Western music, Nashville. So look at these things, and it could well be that they could make mention of some of the pop music concepts, for instance. You might look at pop dress, and probably not stuffed animal pants. But they could make mention of things like blue jeans and why blue jeans became a globalized phenomenon. And we talked about that, where sometimes elements of fashion actually spread and become globalized concepts. Wearing a t shirt is a globalized concept that it had to start somewhere in the whole idea of fashion. So that is just the big ideas out of culture. Remember these things because they often underlie some of the other things in the cultural unit, like language and like religion. So keep these in mind when we're talking about religion, for instance. Think about religious artifacts, physical things that might tell you something about a religion. Um, the big ideas, obviously, the metafacts are usually associated with religion. In language, think about the sociofacts, that when we are using language a certain way, and maybe how that language changes over time, how we use it, either in business or government or something like that. So keep these things in mind. These are the big ideas underpinning all of the cultural unit. And my next stop will be Chapter 5, Language.